"Excuse me, ma'am, you'll need to move your cart. The senator's vehicle is coming through." "I'm not in the way." "Mom, don't make a scene, Sophia, please. You weren't supposed to see me. Not today, not ever." Sophia Reyes stepped out of the United States Capitol, still adjusting to the weight of the oath she had taken 48 hours earlier. Her first floor vote had just ended. Reporters waited at the bottom of the steps. Cameras clicked. Aides moved beside her with practiced efficiency. Then she saw a small woman in a Navy uniform pushing a cleaning cart along the cracked sidewalk at the base of those famous marble stairs. The woman's gray hair was tied back the same way it had always been. The hands gripping the handle of that cart were the same hands that had once corrected her homework, packed her school lunches, and signed the back of her first report card. The mother Sophia had not spoken to in 11 years was working sanitation at the very Capitol where her daughter had just been sworn in as a United States Senator. The shame in her mother's eyes hurt more than the distance ever had. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 11 years earlier, Sophia had been a young state representative in Georgia, fierce, idealistic, completely certain of who she was and what she would not do. Margaret Reyes was the principal of Roosevelt Middle School in suburban Atlanta, the same school she had run for 19 years, the same school that had named a courtyard after her after she had personally raised the funds to restore it. Mother and daughter had been close, the kind of close that survives teenage years and college and early careers. They had Sunday dinners. They argued about politics with affection. Margaret kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned her daughter's name in a leather binder beside the television in her living room. Then came Gregory Halstead. He was a real estate developer with deep pockets and deeper ambitions, the kind of donor who never wrote a check without expecting something signed in return. He had offered Sophia's first state Senate campaign a contribution of $300,000 rooted through a network of small companies that, on paper, looked perfectly legal. Sophia had spent a single afternoon reading the paperwork before she returned every dollar. Her opponent took the money instead. Her opponent won. Sophia lost by less than 2,000 votes. That should have been the end of it. But Gregory was a man who remembered names. And Margaret, who had spent her entire career believing that politics ultimately rewarded principle, made one phone call too many trying to understand why her daughter had walked away from money that everyone else seemed willing to take. Margaret called Sophia that night to plead with her to reconsider for the next race, to be practical, to think about the future. The conversation went badly. Voices were raised. Words were said that neither could take back. Sophia hung up the phone. Margaret did not call again. 11 years passed without either of them picking up the line. Sophia had won her next race, then the next, climbing quietly through Georgia politics with the kind of patient, careful integrity that did not make headlines but did not make enemies either. 2 months ago, she had been elected to fill an unexpected vacancy in the United States Senate. The swearing-in ceremony had been small. Her father had passed away 7 years earlier. Her mother had not been invited because Sophia had not known how to invite her after so many years of silence. 11 years had a way of building walls higher than either side knew how to climb. Now Sophia stood at the top of the Capitol steps, her staff calling her name, her schedule already running late, and below her in a Navy uniform with a small name tag that read MREYES, her mother was looking up at her with eyes that did not seem surprised at all. The aide beside Sophia touched her elbow gently. "Senator, the car is ready." Sophia did not move. The aide followed her gaze, saw nothing remarkable, only a sanitation worker pausing beside a cart and tried again. "Senator." Sophia held up one hand. "1 minute," she said quietly. Then she began walking down the steps, slowly at first, then faster, her heels clicking against marble worn smooth by 2 centuries of politicians who had climbed it before her. Margaret had already turned away by the time Sophia reached the bottom step. She was pushing her cart toward the service entrance on the north side of the building, her shoulders low, her pace deliberate, the practiced movement of someone who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Sophia caught up to her near a row of stone planters where tourists usually posed for photographs. "Mom." The word felt strange in her mouth after so long. It came out smaller than she intended, almost questioning, as if she were not entirely sure she still had the right to use it. Margaret stopped pushing. She did not turn. "Sophia, please go back. Your people are waiting." "How long have you been working here?" "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "Then it shouldn't." Margaret finally turned, and the look on her face was not anger, not even sadness. It was something closer to embarrassment, the kind a mother feels when she is caught being smaller than her child remembers her. "Go do your job. I'm doing mine." Sophia glanced over her shoulder. Her senior aide, a sharp young woman named Priya, was already walking down the steps with a phone pressed to her ear and a calendar visible on the tablet under her arm. The press gaggle had not noticed anything yet, but the cameras had a way of finding stories before the stories found themselves. "I have a town hall in 90 minutes, Sophia said quietly. "I'll come find you after." "Don't." "Mom." "I said don't, Sophia. I came here to clean a sidewalk, that's all." But it was not all. Sophia could see that even now. The capital had hundreds of sanitation positions spread across dozens of buildings, and her mother, a 68-year-old woman with arthritis in both knees, had ended up on the exterior crew at the exact entrance where senators came and went. That was not a coincidence. That was a choice. Sophia did not know yet what the choice meant, but she knew her mother well enough to recognize that Margaret Reyes did nothing by accident. Priya reached them. She had the good sense not to ask questions. She simply held the tablet out and said, "Senator, we need to move. Channel 4 is asking about your statement on the appropriations markup." Sophia took one last look at her mother. Margaret had already turned back to her cart, gripping the handle with both hands, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. "I'll find you," Sophia said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She did not answer. She walked back up the steps with Priya, gave the statement, climbed into the black SUV, and rode to the town hall in complete silence. Priya, to her credit, did not ask. She simply kept rearranging the afternoon schedule and pretending not to notice that her boss was staring out the window with the look of someone who had just been hit by something she could not quite name. The town hall lasted 94 minutes. Sophia answered questions about infrastructure, agricultural subsidies, the new federal contracting reform bill her predecessor had championed. She smiled at the right moments. She remembered the names of the constituents who had driven up from Macon and Savannah. She did the job, but somewhere beneath the prepared remarks, a quieter voice kept asking the same question over and over. What had happened to Roosevelt Middle School? What had happened to the binder of newspaper clippings? What had happened to her mother? When she finally returned to her office on the third floor of the Hart Building that evening, she closed the door, asked Priya to hold all calls, and sat down at the desk that had been delivered only that morning. The leather chair still smelled new. The brass nameplate beside the door read Senator S. Reyes in letters so freshly etched they almost looked wet. She had imagined this office 1,000 times during her years climbing the Georgia State House. She had imagined who would be sitting across from her, who would call to congratulate her, who would visit on her first day. In none of those imagined versions had her mother been pushing a cart on the sidewalk outside. She opened her laptop and typed 3 words into the search bar. Margaret Reyes, principal. The first article that appeared was dated 4 years earlier. The headline made her stop breathing. Sophia read the headline 3 times before she clicked. The article was short, written in the careful, hedged language local papers used when they were not entirely sure what they were reporting on. Margaret Reyes, principal of Roosevelt Middle School for 19 years, had resigned her position following an internal investigation into the misuse of school discretionary funds. The amount in question was $47,000. Margaret had denied wrongdoing. The school board had accepted her resignation without comment. There was a photograph at the bottom of the article. Her mother stood beside a podium with her hands folded in front of her, looking past the camera at something the photographer had not bothered to capture. Sophia opened a second tab. then a third. By the fifth article, the picture became clearer, and the clearer it became, the colder Sophia felt. The investigation had been triggered by an anonymous complaint. The complaint had alleged that Margaret had directed school contracting toward favored vendors in exchange for personal benefit. A forensic accountant had been hired by the district. The accountant's report, which Sophia found buried in an education trade publication, concluded that the discretionary fund had indeed been used in ways that fell outside the strict letter of district policy. Margaret had used the money to buy winter coats for 42 students whose families could not afford them. She had used it to pay overdue lunch balances. She had used it to keep 3 teachers from being terminated mid-year when a budget shortfall came down from the central office. Every dollar was accounted for. Every dollar had been spent on children. None of it had gone into Margaret's pocket. But policy was policy, and the policy said that discretionary funds required pre-approval from the central office for any expenditure over $500. Margaret had not gotten pre-approval. The accountant had recommended a written reprimand. The school board had recommended a 6-month suspension. The superintendent had recommended termination. Margaret had resigned instead. She had walked away from 19 years and a pension that would have vested in 11 more months because the alternative was to drag her name through a public hearing she could not afford to fight. Sophia closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. Then she opened it again and searched for one more name. Gregory Halstead. He was still in Atlanta. He had expanded his real estate holdings into commercial development, then into federal contracting through a subsidiary called Halstead Logistics Group. The subsidiary had won 3 Department of Defense storage contracts in the last 4 years. There was a 4th contract under review now, a much larger one, almost $200 million. The decision would come before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs within the next month. The committee Sophia had been assigned to on her first day in office. She sat back in the leather chair. The brass nameplate caught the last light coming through the office window. Somewhere in the building, a janitor was running a vacuum down a long marble hallway. The sound carried faintly through the closed door, and Sophia thought, irrationally, that it might be her mother, that her mother might be only a few floors below her at this very moment, pushing a cart down a corridor where her daughter would never see her. She picked up her phone and called Priya. "I need you to find me a name. Atlanta Public Schools, Roosevelt Middle School, 4 years ago. There was an anonymous complaint that started an investigation into the principal. I want to know who filed it. Senator, I'm not sure that's something we can find a way." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am." Sophia hung up and walked to the window. Down on Constitution Avenue, the streetlights had come on. A few late tourists were taking pictures of the dome. The Capitol at night looked the way it always looked in postcards, lit from below, gleaming white, a building that had been designed to make people feel small in a particular kind of way. She thought about her mother riding the bus home to whatever small apartment she now lived in. She thought about the leather binder of newspaper clippings. She wondered whether her mother had kept it. Then she went home and did not sleep. Priya called at 6:43 the next morning. Sophia had already been awake for 2 hours, sitting at her kitchen table in a robe with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. The complaint was filed by a man named Daniel Whitfield. He was a parent at Roosevelt at the time. His son had been disciplined by your mother the previous spring for what the records describe as repeated harassment of female classmates. The son was suspended for 2 weeks, and Whitfield, he's a regional sales director for a property management company called Crestline Holdings. Who owns Crestline Holdings? Priya paused before answering, and Sophia already knew what was coming. It's a subsidiary of Halstead Properties, ma'am. Gregory Halstead is the principal owner. Sophia closed her eyes. The pieces were not subtle. They had never been subtle. Gregory had not forgotten her. He had not forgotten the $300,000 she had returned, or the months he had spent calling in favors to make sure her first race ended the way it did. When he could not reach Sophia directly, he had reached for the person closest to her. He had used a disgruntled parent and a manufactured complaint to push a 64-year-old principal out of the only career she had ever known. He had cost Margaret her pension, her reputation, and the small dignity of retiring on her own terms. And he had done it patiently 4 years ago when Sophia was still a state senator in Atlanta and could not have imagined that she would one day sit on the committee reviewing his federal contracts. Priya, I need you to pull the Halstead Logistics file. Everything. Past contracts, performance reviews, subcontractor agreements, the current bid, the names of everyone on the review board. I want it on my desk by 10. Yes, ma'am, and the meeting with the majority leader at 9. Keep it, I'll be there. She hung up and stared at the cold coffee. The hardest part was not the anger. The anger came easily, the way anger always did. The hardest part was the question underneath the anger, the one she had not allowed herself to ask in 11 years. What if her mother had been right that night? Not about Gregory's money. Margaret had never said Sophia should take the money. That had not been the argument. The argument had been about something smaller and stranger and more painful. Margaret had said that night that Sophia did not understand how much it cost other people when she made her stands, that principles were free for the person holding them, but the bill always arrived for someone else. Sophia had been 29 years old. She had thought her mother was making excuses for cowardice. She had said so. She had used that exact word, coward. She had called her own mother a coward, and her mother had said quietly, "One day you'll find out who pays for the choices you make, Sophia, and you'll be sorry it isn't always you." 11 years later, sitting in a Washington kitchen with a Senate identification card on the counter beside her, Sophia finally understood what her mother had been trying to tell her. Margaret had not been a coward. Margaret had been a woman who already knew, even then, that men like Gregory Halstead did not lose gracefully. Margaret had been afraid not for herself, but for what would happen if her daughter kept walking the road she was walking. And when the bill had finally arrived, Margaret had been the one to pay it, alone, in silence, without ever picking up the phone to ask her daughter for help. Sophia got dressed. She put on the navy suit she had bought for the swearing-in. She rode to the Capitol in the back of a black car and did not speak to the driver. At 9, she sat across from the majority leader and discussed committee assignments with the appropriate measure of deference. At 10, she returned to her office. The file Priya had assembled was already waiting on her desk, 3 inches thick, neatly tabbed. She did not open it, not yet. She picked up her phone instead and called the number Priya had texted her at 6:50 that morning, the direct line to the Capitol Facilities Services office. "Yes, hello. I'd like to leave a message for one of your employees. Her name is Margaret Reyes." The woman on the other end of the line was patient and slightly confused. She explained that the facility staff did not receive personal calls during shift hours, that any non-emergency message would have to be passed along at the end of the day, and that the senator was welcome to leave her name and a callback number. "This is Senator Sophia Reyes. Margaret Reyes is my mother. I'd like to ask her to dinner tonight. Please tell her I will be at the Dubliner on F Street at 7, and that I will wait until she comes, even if it takes all night." There was a long pause. "I'll see that she gets the message, Senator." Sophia hung up. She did not know whether her mother would come. She suspected she would not. Margaret was not a woman who responded well to being summoned, and the Dubliner was the kind of place where a senator was likely to be recognized within 5 minutes of sitting down. But Sophia had needed to say it out loud, to put the invitation into the world where her mother could feel it. Whatever happened next would happen. She spent the rest of the day with the Halstead file. The contracts were complicated, the way these things always were. Halstead Logistics Group had won its first Department of Defense storage contract 18 months after Margaret's resignation. The contract was small, $19 million, the kind of bid that usually went to a well-established firm rather than a developer pivoting into federal work. The performance review had been adequate but not exceptional. The second contract had come 12 months later, larger, with a performance review that included a footnote about delayed deliverables. The third had come on the strength of a recommendation from a subcommittee staffer who, Sophia discovered after another hour of reading, had left government work 6 weeks after the recommendation and joined Halstead Properties as Vice President of Government Affairs. The pattern was not illegal. It was, in many places, not even unusual. But the new bid, the $200 million one, was different. Halstead Logistics was proposing to manage classified document storage at 3 regional facilities. The proposal claimed compliance with federal security standards that Sophia, after a careful reading, was reasonably certain the company did not actually meet. The subcontractor list included 2 firms that had been cited for security breaches at private installations in the last 3 years. The pricing structure was suspiciously thin in the margins where oversight would be most expensive. At 3 in the afternoon, Sophia closed the file and called the committee chairman. "Senator Hargrove, this is Sophia Reyes. I need to discuss a recusal." Hargrove was an older senator from Wyoming who had been on the committee for 16 years. He listened without interrupting, while Sophia explained that she had a personal connection to a party associated with one of the pending contractor bids, that the connection was old but unresolved, and that the appearance of conflict, even if a conflict could not be definitively established, was severe enough that she did not believe she could participate in the review with the impartiality the committee required. "That's a hell of a thing to disclose on your 4th day in office, Senator." "Yes, sir, I'm aware. Can I ask what the connection is?" "It's personal. I'd rather not put it in writing yet, but I'll come to your office tomorrow morning and walk you through it if you'll give me half an hour." There was a long silence. Then Hargrove said, "8 o'clock. Bring coffee." She hung up and exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. At 6:45 she left the office. Priya offered to ride with her to the restaurant. Sophia thanked her and said no. She took a cab. She got out 2 blocks early and walked the rest of the way through the cold November evening, past the bars where Hill staffers were already starting their Friday nights, past the lobbyists in their long coats. The Dubliner had a small wooden door and warm yellow windows. Sophia took a corner booth, ordered a glass of red wine, and watched the door. At 7:15 the door opened. Margaret stepped inside, still in her navy uniform, her hair pulled back, her face the color of someone who had not eaten all day. She saw Sophia and stopped walking. For a long moment, neither woman moved. 21:34 Then Margaret walked over and sat down across from her daughter. She did not take off her coat. She did not look at the menu. She placed her hands on the table the way she had once placed them on a podium at school board meetings, fingers loosely interlaced, knuckles pale. "I'm not staying long," she said. "Okay. I came so you would stop calling the facility's office. They have rules about personal calls during shifts. I don't need anyone thinking I asked for special treatment." "I understand." A waiter approached. Sophia waved him away gently. Margaret watched the gesture and something in her face tight, the small, involuntary recognition of a daughter who now had the kind of authority that made waiters disappear. "I read about Roosevelt," Sophia said. Margaret did not respond. "I read about the discretionary fund, the coats, the lunch balances, the teachers. There is nothing to read about. I resigned. You were pushed. I made my decision." "Mom, don't, Sophia, don't sit there and tell me what happened to me. I lived it. You read about it last night. Those are not the same thing." The words landed harder than Sophia expected. She had spent the entire day rehearsing what she was going to say in this conversation. She had imagined herself laying out the evidence carefully, the way she would have laid it out for a committee, walking her mother through what she now understood about Gregory Halstead, about Daniel Whitfield, about the patient, 4-year arc of a man's revenge. She had imagined her mother accepting this account with relief, perhaps even gratitude, the way a person accepts a diagnosis that finally explains years of unexplained pain. But Margaret was not interested in being diagnosed. Margaret had carried the weight of those years by herself, in silence, and the last thing she needed was a daughter who had been absent for the entire ordeal arriving now to explain the ordeal back to her. Sophia tried again more quietly. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. You weren't supposed to be there. We hadn't spoken." "That's my point. That's exactly my point." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. The waiter passed by again and Sophia waved him off again. A man at the bar glanced over and Sophia knew, the way she now had to always know, that within 5 minutes someone would be texting a friend that Senator Reyes was at the Dubliner having an intense conversation with an older woman in a sanitation uniform. Margaret seemed to sense the same thing. Her shoulders curled inward slightly, the protective posture of someone who had spent 4 years trying to be invisible. "Why are you here, Mom? I told you." The phone calls. "No, why are you in Washington? Why are you on that crew? There are sanitation jobs in Atlanta." Margaret looked down at her hands. "You moved here for me," Sophia said. "I moved here because the contractor was hearing and the pay was acceptable." "Mom, the pay was acceptable, Sophia. You wanted to see me." The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Then Margaret said very quietly, "I wanted to know you were doing well. I didn't want to interfere." "I wasn't going to interfere. I was going to clean the sidewalk and ride the bus home, and that was going to be enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough for me." Sophia felt her eyes fill and looked away quickly, blinking hard, because she could not afford to cry in a restaurant where a man at the bar was already glancing over for the second time. When she looked back, her mother was watching her with an expression Sophia had not seen in 11 years. Not anger, not even sadness. Something tireder and softer and more forgiving than Sophia had any right to expect. "There's something I have to tell you," Sophia said, "about why you lost your job." "I know why I lost my job." "You know it was Gregory." Margaret did not flinch. "I've known for 4 years, Sophia." Sophia stared at her. "I have a file at home," her mother said. "I'd like you to come see it." Margaret's apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a building in Anacostia that smelled faintly of old radiators and somebody's slow-cooked dinner. The hallway carpet was thin. The single window in the living room looked out at the brick wall of the building next door. Sophia took it all in without comment as her mother turned on a lamp and gestured to a small kitchen table. The leather binder of newspaper clippings was on the bookshelf beside the television. Sophia saw it the moment she walked in. It was thicker than she remembered. 11 years of articles had been added to it, articles her mother had cut out and pasted and dated in her careful schoolteacher handwriting, even during the silence, even when there was no daughter to share them with. Sophia did not trust herself to look at it directly. Margaret put a kettle on the stove and brought a second binder to the table. This one was newer, a black 3-ring binder with a label on the spine that read simply HALSTED. She set it down between them and sat down across from her daughter and folded her hands on top of it the way she had folded them at the restaurant. "After I resigned, I knew something was wrong with how it happened. The complaint was too specific. Whitfield was angry about his son's suspension, but he didn't have the documents the investigator received. Someone gave him those documents. I spent 6 months figuring out who. You investigated it yourself. I was a principal, Sophia. I knew how to read records. I knew how to make phone calls. I knew which secretaries would talk to me and which would not. It wasn't difficult. It was only patient." She opened the binder. Inside, the work was meticulous. There were copies of the original complaint with the document references highlighted. There were printouts of the district's internal communications, obtained through a public records request Margaret had filed under her own name 9 months after her resignation. There was a timeline showing the precise dates when Daniel Whitfield had begun contracting work for Crestline Holdings, including the start date of his employment, which had been 2 weeks before he filed the complaint against Margaret. There were copies of 3 emails between a member of the school board and an attorney at a firm that, Margaret had discovered, had represented Halstead Properties for 19 years. There was more. There was a memo from the superintendent's office, marked confidential, that referenced a private conversation with a major donor regarding the Reyes matter. The donor was not named. The memo was dated 4 days before Margaret had been informed of the investigation. "I never sent any of this to a lawyer," Margaret said. "I never gave it to a reporter. I sat on it." "Why?" "Because I knew what would happen if I did. Gregory has more money than I have. He has more lawyers. He would have buried me in countersuits for 10 years, and I would have spent my retirement paying defense costs and watching my name get worse, not better. I knew I couldn't win that fight. So I kept the file and I went on with my life. Mom, I kept it for a reason, Sophia. Sophia looked up from the binder. I kept it because I thought one day maybe you might be in a position where it would be useful to someone, not to me. I was not going to ask you to use it for me. I knew our situation. I knew we weren't speaking. But I thought if she ever ends up somewhere that matters and she ever needs to know what kind of man he is, the file should exist. So I kept it. The kettle whistled. Margaret got up and poured 2 cups of tea and brought them to the table and sat back down. Sophia could not speak. She turned a page in the binder and then another, and then she closed it and pressed her palm flat on top of it and finally said the only thing she could think to say. He's bidding on a federal contract, $200 million. The vote is in 3 weeks. I'm on the committee. Margaret did not look surprised. She had probably known that too. I recused myself this afternoon. Her mother nodded slowly. Good, she said. At 8 the next morning, Sophia walked into Senator Hargrove's office carrying 2 cups of coffee and the black binder Margaret had handed her across the kitchen table the night before. Hargrove was already at his desk, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a stack of briefing memos open in front of him. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up. Coffee, Sophia said. Set it down. She set it down. Then she set the binder down beside it. Senator Hargrove, the contractor I mentioned yesterday, is Halstead Logistics Group. The conflict is that Gregory Halstead, the principal owner, manufactured a misconduct investigation that forced my mother out of her job 4 years ago. She was a public school principal in Atlanta. The investigation was retaliation for a campaign donation I refused from him 12 years ago when I was running for state senate in Georgia. My mother documented all of this herself, on her own, without anyone's help, over the course of several years. The documentation is in this binder. I am not asking you to act on it. I am giving it to you because I am recusing myself from the committee's review of the Halstead bid, and I believe the committee should have access to information relevant to the bidder's character and conduct. Hargrove looked at her over the rims of his reading glasses for a long moment. Then he pulled the binder toward him and opened it. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. Sophia drank her coffee. At one point he picked up his phone and called his chief of staff and asked her to clear the next 2 hours of his schedule. He did not look up while he made the call. When he finally closed the binder, he sat back in his chair and exhaled. Senator Reyes. Yes, sir. I have been in this town for 31 years. I have seen a great many things. I have not often seen a binder like this one. My mother was a careful woman. Your mother was a very careful woman. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. I want to be clear with you about something. I am not going to use this to destroy a contractor. That is not how this committee works, and it is not how I work. But I am going to refer this binder to the Inspector General's office at the Department of Defense, and I am going to ask the committee council to review the bid documentation against the standards we apply to integrity disclosures. If the contractor's conduct does not meet those standards, the bid will fail on its own merits. I will not have to lift a finger. That's all I'm asking, sir. It's more than most people ask for. Most people would have asked me to lift a finger. Sophia did not respond to that. Hargrove stood up and walked her to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. Your mother, is she still in Washington? Yes, sir. What does she do? She works for the Capitol Facilities contractor. The exterior sanitation crew. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll be damned. Sophia smiled just barely for the first time in 24 hours. The Inspector General's office moved faster than Sophia expected. Within 9 days, the Department of Defense had issued a request for additional documentation from Halstead Logistics regarding the security certifications on the proposed facilities. Within 14 days, 2 of the listed subcontractors had withdrawn from the bid, citing concerns about the audit climate. Within 19 days, an investigative reporter at a national newspaper, working from a tip that had not come from Sophia's office but might have come from somewhere adjacent to it, published a long piece on the relationship between Daniel Whitfield, Crestline Holdings, and the Reyes investigation in Atlanta. The piece named Gregory Halstead in the 7th paragraph. The bid collapsed publicly 2 days after the article ran. Halstead Logistics withdrew its proposal, citing what its lawyers described as a hostile review environment. The withdrawal was not the end of Gregory Halstead's career, but it was, Sophia suspected, the end of his federal aspirations. Men like Gregory were rarely destroyed. They were simply diminished, and diminishment for a man like that was its own kind of sentence. Margaret did not celebrate. Sophia had not expected her to. What Margaret did instead was retire. She gave the contractor 2 weeks' notice, the same way she had given the school district 2 weeks' notice 4 years earlier, with the same handwritten letter and the same small, careful signature. The supervisor of the facility's crew, a woman named Yolanda who had been on the job for 23 years and had known Margaret was somebody's mother long before she had figured out exactly whose, hugged her on her last day and slipped a small wrapped package into her bag. Margaret opened it on the bus home. It was a navy blue scarf. The note inside read, "For the lady who always dressed like a principal even on the sidewalk." Margaret cried on the bus. It was the first time she had cried since the day she had resigned from Roosevelt. Sophia found a small house for her in a quiet neighborhood in Northeast Washington, a brick row house with a tiny garden in the back and a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs. Margaret refused at first. She said the apartment in Anacostia was acceptable, that she did not need to be rescued, that she had not come to Washington to be installed in a daughter's life like a piece of furniture. Sophia did not argue. She simply gave her mother the address and the keys and said the house would be there whether Margaret used it or not, and that the lease was already paid for the year. Margaret moved in 3 weeks later. She did not say thank you. She did not have to. The first piece of legislation Sophia introduced in the United States Senate was a short bill, only 14 pages long. It was co-sponsored by a Republican senator from Oklahoma, whose own mother had been a school superintendent in a small town outside Tulsa, and who had read about the Halstead matter in the newspaper, and had called Sophia's office, unprompted to ask whether she would be open to working together on something. The bill was titled, in the formal language of the Senate, "The Protection of Veteran Public School Administrators from Improper Influence Act." Everyone in Sophia's office called it the Margaret Act. The bill required school districts receiving federal education funding to maintain an independent review process for misconduct complaints filed against administrators with more than 15 years of service. It required disclosure of any financial relationship between board members and complainants. It established a federal hotline for retaliated administrators to report concerns confidentially. It did not undo what had happened to Margaret. Sophia knew it could not. But it made it harder, in a small and specific way, for the next Gregory to do to the next Margaret what had been done in Atlanta. The bill passed the committee with a unanimous vote. It passed the Senate 4 months later by a margin Sophia had not dared to hope for. It was signed into law on a cold Tuesday in March, and the president invited Sophia to the Oval Office for the signing, and Sophia asked if she could bring her mother. Margaret wore a navy dress she had bought at a department store the week before. She had her hair done at a salon 2 blocks from the house Sophia had found her. She did not say much during the signing. She stood behind her daughter and watched the president's pen move across the paper. When the president turned and handed her the pen, the way presidents sometimes do for the people behind the policy, Margaret took it carefully and looked at it for a long moment. "For the principal," the president said. "Thank you, sir," Margaret said. That was all. In the car on the way back to the Capitol, Margaret sat in the front passenger seat and Sophia sat in the back. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 blocks. Then Margaret said, without turning around, "I never thought I would walk into that building. I know. I never thought I would walk into the other one either." She meant the Capitol, the first day, the cart, the morning Sophia had come down the steps. "I'm glad you did," Sophia said. Margaret nodded once slowly. Then she reached back between the seats and rested her hand on her daughter's. They did not let go for the rest of the ride. The leather binder of newspaper clippings sat on a shelf in the new living room now, between a small potted fern and a framed photograph of Sophia's father. Margaret had brought it with her from Atlanta to Anacostia and from Anacostia to the brick row house, and she still added to it slowly, the way she had always added to it. There were clippings from the Halstead story. There were clippings from the passage of the Margaret Act. There was a small color photograph, cut from a magazine, of Sophia standing at the lectern in the Senate chamber on the day she had given her floor speech in support of the bill. In the speech, Sophia had not mentioned her mother by name. She had not had to. Everyone in the chamber had known. On Sunday afternoons now, Sophia came to the row house for dinner. Margaret cooked slowly with the care of a woman who had not cooked for her daughter in 11 years and who intended to make up for some of those Sundays, even though both of them knew that all of them could not be made up. They talked about small things: the garden, a book Margaret was reading, a vote Sophia had taken. They did not talk much about the years between. There would be time for that perhaps, or perhaps there would not. Some silences did not need to be filled. Some silences had carried both of them through, and the women who had survived them did not feel obligated to dissect what survival had cost. Sometimes, when the dishes were done, they sat together on the front porch, Margaret in one chair, Sophia in the other. The street was quiet. A neighbor walked a small dog. A child rode by on a bicycle that was slightly too large for him. Margaret would close her eyes and tilt her face up toward whatever sun the late afternoon still had to offer, and Sophia would watch her mother's face and think about how much smaller she looked now than she had on the day at the Capitol, and how much larger. Gregory Halstead retired from his company 8 months after the bid collapsed. The reporting did not destroy him, but it did follow him, the way a particular kind of reporting follows a particular kind of man for the rest of his career. His name appeared in 2 more articles over the next year, both of them about other contracts he had pursued and lost. After that he stopped appearing. Sophia did not know what had become of him, and she did not look. Margaret never asked. Daniel Whitfield lost his job at Crestline Holdings 6 weeks after the article ran. Sophia never learned what had become of him either. His son, who had been suspended from Roosevelt all those years ago, had grown up and graduated from a state college and, according to a brief item Margaret found in the Atlanta paper, was working as a counselor at a community mental health center. Margaret cut the article out and placed it in the binder. She did not show it to Sophia. Some things were just for her. The Senate chamber, when Sophia entered it now, no longer felt as heavy as it had on the first day. It still felt important. It still felt larger than she was. But she had stopped being afraid of being too small for it. Her mother had pushed a cart at the bottom of those steps for 96 days before her daughter had noticed her, and what Sophia had finally come to understand, in the months after she had noticed, was that the cart had not been a sign of how far her mother had fallen. The cart had been a sign of how far her mother had been willing to walk. Margaret had crossed half the country to stand on a sidewalk near her daughter, and she had done it without asking for a single thing, and she had carried in her apartment, all the while, the file that would eventually make her daughter's career mean something. That was not falling. That was the opposite of falling. If this story made you think about a parent you have not called in a long time, or a parent who has been waiting longer than they ever told you, please consider this your reminder.